1 week ago today, there was a large release from the JFK archive, and you all know who we're going to ask to come on to talk about it. It's our friend of the show, Jefferson Morley, veteran journalist who has been going through these records for many decades now.
Yeah.
We don't want to date you. But it's been a couple of years.
Yeah.
It's been a few months at least. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to wait to have you on so that you had time to kind of digest. Because when stuff first comes out, you're like, oh wow, look at this. You're like, oh wait, they already released this. They just put a different date on it and kind of did a different kind of redaction. So
I had that familiar dismal experience 15 minutes after the 60,000 pages of material drop. I get a call and somebody say, is there a smoking gun? And I say, well, I'm only reading the third document of the 60. Right. So yes, after a week, we've had a chance to absorb and figure out what's important here. So there's a couple of things, we need to step back. We're not going to get the answer in a day. Mm-hmm. People want a smoking gun. I say, don't look for a smoking gun. Look for a fact pattern.
Yes.
Okay? Don't push the string of a theory. Look for a fact pattern and let the fact pattern tell you what's really going on here. And after 60 years, with this very significant disclosure that we got last week, the story of what happened in 1963 is becoming clearer. Mm-hmm. Two documents came out that I think are really important, and they kind of set the stage for what we're going to learn and what we have learned. And, I want to caution people, this is a very complicated story. We're talking about covert operations. Yeah. So they're wrapped in official secrecy, they're wrapped in deceptive statements, and we're only learning about them many years later. But as we learn about them, we do see a new fact pattern. So that's one thing.
Okay.
What are the important documents? The first, I think, is one that really sets the stage. It's a memo that Arthur Schlesinger wrote to President Kennedy.
This is F2, if we can put this up here.
Yeah, let's put it up on the screen.
Yeah. A whole page of this document had been secret for 62 years. You can see that on the left. Mm-hmm. And on the right was what we got last week. And this is a very significant chapter because what's this memo? Kennedy is furious after the Bay of Pigs. He felt that the CIA was trying to impose their foreign policy on him. Mm-hmm. And he said, how could I have been so dumb? And he raged. There's a quote that you'll see all the time. I want to split the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter to the winds. He said that to a New York Times reporter who reported it later. But when Kennedy calmed down, he said, well, what can I do? And Arthur Schlesinger, a liberal advisor, said, well, what you could do is you could reorganize the CIA. And he writes a long memo. If you want to do that, Mr. President, here's how you do it. And here's why you do it. And this page that was kept secret for 60 years really tells the why of what Kennedy wanted to do. Now, ultimately, Kennedy didn't do it, right? Mm-hmm. It was a big job to reorganize the CIA. He had other priorities. He decided not to do it. But this is an insight into his thinking, and it's an insight into his thinking that the CIA didn't want anybody to know about.
Why? What is it? Yeah. What does it tell us?
It tells us a bunch of things. What Schlesinger is talking about in this passage is what's called controlled American sources. These are American sources that we totally control. CIA officers who work for the U.S. government in official cover positions. And Schlesinger says, the CIA is encroaching on your foreign policy. And he says, at the time of your inauguration, 47% of the State Department political officers around the world were in fact CIA officers. 47%. We knew a lot of CIA officers took those cover positions.
Right.
We didn't know they had half of them. That's in 1960. And it made me wonder, what's that figure today?
Yeah. Right.
And you know
That's
what?
The deep state.
It's probably just as high.
Yeah, you know what?
Being honest.
And it's a classified secret.
Right.
So this is very sensitive stuff. 123 people working in the Paris embassy were with the CIA. And in there, Schlesinger tells a very telling anecdote. In 1961, there was an attempted coup against French President Charles de Gaulle. Mm-hmm. He was trying to pull out of Algeria. Algeria was kind of like Vietnam for America. Yeah. It was like this intractable foreign involvement, and just ultimately we just had to get out, but very divisive at home. And so divisive, in fact, that the right wing in the French government went after de Gaulle, and they were going to overthrow him. And the story was that it was known that the CIA station in Paris was on the top floor of the U.S. Embassy. And the story was the lights in the embassy were on all night on the night of the coup. Mm-hmm. And de Gaulle always thought that the CIA was behind that coup. A year later, when a group of assassins from the same right-wing faction try and ambush de Gaulle when he's going to his country house, and almost succeed. Unlike Kennedy, de Gaulle had a very good driver. And when the shots rang out, he did exactly the right thing and evaded the gunfire. And de Gaulle escaped. But de Gaulle thought the CIA knew about that attempt on his life. And de Gaulle never believed the official story of the assassination. So that story, this memo, that page, is the origin story of the mistrust between the CIA, between Kennedy and the CIA, that would endure for the rest of his presidency.
Right. I think that's so important for you to lay that out in
The
that way.
suspicion that the CIA might assassinate a...
Right. So what is the decision tree that flows from this memo? How do we then get to characters like Angleton and the organization of an eventual alleged plot?
Right. So the second most important document that came out it's actually not one document. It was 9 documents about...
Let's put up F4.
Yeah,
about 9 documents about James Angleton. And, so I don't go looking for one document that's going to tell me the whole thing. But when you look at these documents taken together, and documents that have been released in recent years, you understand something that I just don't think people, I know no one knows, and the mainstream media organizations just don't want to talk about it, okay? Lee Harvey Oswald was not a lone nut, okay?
Right.
He was a known quantity to a small group of CIA counterintelligence officers for 4 years. Between November 1959 and November 1963, we now have all of the information that the CIA had on Oswald. 42 documents, 180 pages of material, okay? And, he was followed from beginning to end. There was no point in those 4 years, or very few points in those 4 years, where top people in the CIA did not have Lee Harvey Oswald's home address.
Wow.
Between November 1915, and the guy's moving all the time.
Right.
He goes to Moscow, to Minsk, he comes back to Fort Worth, he moves to New Orleans, he comes back to Dallas, he goes to Mexico, he comes back to Dallas. Every step of the way, top people in the CIA knew about it. So that alone is, that's another thing that sets the context. Now, I have a lot of arguments with, mainstream media journalists who say, they were just incompetent. They just missed him. Okay, well, a couple of things. And this is what's important about the document that came out last week. Angleton, this new document shows, lied under oath to JFK investigators. And there's a very stark exchange in the new document, which shows very clearly that he lied about Oswald's involvement in one CIA project. But Oswald tripped many CIA. So what Angleton was hiding and what the CIA was hiding and what the story of the quote-unquote lone gunman hides, is this extraordinary level of interest at the top of the CIA in this alleged pathetic, sociopathic, loser who nobody would ever care about, or so we are often told. And yet, James Angleton, one of the smartest, most capable intelligence officers of his generation, regarded as the premier counterintelligence officer in the Western world, is paying attention to Lee Harvey Oswald for 4 years. The CIA has never explained this. So, because they don't have to, because reporters from the New York Times don't go and say, what is this, And you have this weird cognitive dissonance going on where, people won't look at this new evidence. They won't talk about it. They won't cover it, because it works like this. Well, that's a piece of evidence that's of interest to Morley, and we know he's a conspiracy theorist. So that's kind of tainted evidence, and we don't need to think about it because we know for sure that Oswald killed the president.
Right.
It's like, and so that's been going on for years, and so, nobody knows the story that's just coming into view. So, I'm saying somehow this is part of the JFK story. You can't say, one question was, does this change the narrative? No one document changes the narrative, but the entire Oswald file that James Angleton had on his desk when Kennedy left for Dallas, that changes the narrative. What the file shows, there were 2 FBI reports on Oswald, everything he had been doing recently. He'd gotten arrested, he'd gone to Mexico City, he'd come back. 2 FBI reports saying Oswald's in Dallas. They land on Angleton's desk on November 14th and 15th, 1963. Wow. Never been explained.
Wow.
So that's where we're at. And, will the CIA explain? unlike the FBI, the CIA has not turned over any new documents as a result of Trump's order. The CIA, I would say, is not in compliance with Trump's order. They have JFK documents in their possession. So what happens with the CIA? Are they going to turn over the JFK documents they have in their hands? That's a big question. But with these two documents, I think we see kind of the big picture of Kennedy in conflict with his national security establishment, and CIA officers paying close attention to the man who supposedly killed him. And we're going to learn more about that. And it is complicated, but I'll tell you a little bit of good news. I am going to testify before Representative Luna's hearing on JFK on April 1st.
Excellent.
And I'm going to talk about this. And you need to slow down, and I'm hoping that I'll have the time to explain to the task force, what this story is and how we can get the rest of it. What's interesting about this story is, I'm so happy to be here because right now, requests for interviews are running about 2-to-1, 3-to-1 in favor of conservative sites.
Oh, really?
Yeah, right? Jesse Waters called me up. Jesse is my new best friend. I go on his show, and he's like, those Democrats, they're burning down the Teslas all over the world. And I'm sitting there, man, I can't afford a Tesla. I drive a Nissan Rogue. I wouldn't.
Why is he asking you about Teslas?
Yeah, right.
No, he didn't.
No,
he didn't
it's
ask
probably in the lead-in.
No. So that was the show before, and I'm thinking I'm going to say something to this guy. I'm going to say something to this guy. And then he comes on and he does like a 4-minute introduction to JFK's story, and it's like, I pretty much agree with that, Jesse. And you know what I realized? I think what the JFK issue does is it unites the anti-war base of both sides.
That's right.
On the left, people remember Kennedy as an inspiring leader, wants to end the Cold War, wants to take the American empire in a new direction, and are anti-war today, right? Like whatever the details of Ukraine and Gaza, we're against those wars because we're against war in general. We don't think there's good wars. Those wars could have been prevented. And on the right, you have a similar sentiment. It's more about we don't want to spend our blood and treasure on foreigners, okay? But it's anti-war also. It's an abhorrence of war. That's what's driving the JFK story, and that's what brings people together. And that's why I have no problem going on Jesse Waters,
And Angleton's relationship with Israeli intelligence has also been getting a lot of attention. Can you unpack some of that?
About that?
Yeah, so I talked about don't look at one document, look at 9 documents. So the 9 documents about Angleton tell 2 stories that are important. One is about the birth of COINTELPRO, okay? COINTELPRO is typically thought of as an FBI program, right? J. Edgar Hoover, it's associated with J. Edgar Hoover, but COINTELPRO was really a joint CIA-FBI program, and which Angleton, as counterintelligence chief, had a lot of influence on a counterintelligence program of the FBI. So that's one thing, and we can talk about how that emerged. That's a very interesting story that doesn't take you into the history of JFK's assassination, but takes you into the history of the repression of the left in the 60s. Very important story.
Yes.
And the stuff about the Fair Play for Cuba committee that's in here, that's another story that's coming, and I've got another good story about CIA spies in New Orleans. It's very cool.
Oh, this will be fun.
So I'm going to tease that for you. But the other thing that the 9 Angleton documents that came in was his very close relations with the Israelis. And he gave testimony, Angleton gave testimony to the Church Committee in June 1975. He'd just been fired from the CIA. He's eager to justify himself and say, look, I was doing good. And he explains his extraordinary relationship with the Israeli security services, going back to 1951, when he and David Ben-Gurion come over and make a deal with Allen Dulles about how the 2 intelligence services will share information. That story of Angleton and the Israeli services, which I talk about in my book about Angleton, The Ghost, and let me plug that right now.
Sure, go to link in the description.
Yes, The Ghost, The Secret Life of James Jesus Angleton, tells this story. And I had read a lot of these documents I'd read all of these documents when I did my book. And now for the first time I see them and we understand the Angleton story with new clarity. The birth of COINTELPRO and the birth of U.S.-Israeli strategic relationship. Angleton, like him or not, people told me, people who liked him said, this guy's a world historic figure. And you can say he's sinister and he did bad things and all that, but that is not an unfair estimation of James Angleton. And he's at the center of what we're learning about the JFK story.
This is where, my brain always gets so tickled too about the COINTELPRO, like you were saying. And so, I was curious if we shed even more light. This gets to a bigger question. Ben Shapiro recently had a viral clip. I talked about it in your introduction before you were here about where he was like, "Who cares who killed JFK?" And he's like, "I think it's interesting, but it's it happened in 1963. We're in 2025." And so I talked to Oliver Stone about this. He gave me such a poetic answer. But I want to ask you the same thing. Why does it matter who killed JFK?
Because when JFK was killed and there was no accountability, the American empire took a turn. Kennedy was trying to steer the ship one way. And when Kennedy was killed and there was no accountability, the ship was steered another way. And we never had a course correction after that, because the faction that avoided accountability with Kennedy's murder and avoided responsibility for it, they had impunity. And they could dominate all the policy debates that followed. And also because they had the secrecy of the apparatus of secrecy around them. Why does it matter? Here we are attacking the Houthis, okay? A people who, pose no threat to the American people.
As our vice president says secretly in his chat, we only have 3% of the trade that moves through this. Why are we doing this?
Right. And so, I imagine a young John F. Kennedy running for president, and here we're bombing the hell out of these people 7,000 miles away. And I remember what JFK said at American University. We do not want a Pax Americana. We are not the world's policemen. That would be JFK's message to us today.
Yes.
And that's the relevance for Ben Shapiro, right there. Yeah. We do not want a Pax Americana. Imagine a Democratic presidential candidate saying that today. I think if one did, they would find a lot of success.
Right.
And I think the fact that there was no accountability led to what to me is the most salient fact about JFK's assassination, that pretty much every president after him, definitely Johnson, definitely Nixon, you can talk about whether it's every single one, whether or not the CIA or the security services killed Kennedy, those presidents believed that they did or probably did. And as the person now occupying that chair, that changes your calculation when you're in the room with them talking about how many covered agents they've got in the embassy, and whether or not you're going to reduce that.
You can hear it in Johnson's phone calls. He's terrified.
Like Chuck Schumer said, Trump is going to find out that the CIA
That's right. Yeah, he's like, oh, they're going to find, it's like, oh my God, we're just saying this stuff out loud. You can hear it with Nixon. Nixon, I mean, not that he was a great guy or whatever, but you could hear the terror in him and in Haldeman's voice. They're like, listen, with Hoover, like, we got to
I tell the story. I tell the story in my book. Nixon calls Helms into the Oval Office. Dick, I want that report on the Van Pigs, goddammit.
Right.
And Helms is like, Mr. President, why do you need that? And you hear Nixon say it. The who shot John angle. Nixon thought.
He knew. Yeah. Exactly.
Johnson told Walter, one of his aides, that he thought the CIA was involved. He didn't believe the Warren Commission. And I always ask people, if Lyndon Johnson, who appointed the Warren Commission, didn't believe its conclusions, like, why should I?
Right.
Like, well, why is that irrational?
Yes. Where do you come down, by the way, on Johnson's knowledge or anything? Like,
I think the most telling thing about Lyndon Johnson is that within 2 days, he said, we have to prove Oswald acted alone.
Yes.
Right? I mean, he's ordered his finding before the investigation has begun. What was he afraid of? He was afraid that he would have to investigate his own government and tear his own government apart, or he would have to go to war with the Soviet Union or Cuba. And he didn't want to do either one of those things. Right. So Oswald was the perfect solution. The patsy, the fall guy. It's all his fault. Nothing's wrong. Let's move along, people. And that was the political solution. And it held. And a lot of people bought it. And a lot of people bought it for the best reasons. We believe in our government. And, this is a terrible tragedy. And we have to cope with it somehow. And there's this story. It's hard to believe. But, let's get on with it. And people's trust was really abused. And, and now, here's where the CIA inherits the whirlwind, right? Because their bogus story about Lee Harvey Oswald has bred a conspiratorial culture.
Yes.
That thrives on suspicion of government and undermines it. And, that's a terrible thing. And so when I go on these shows, the right-wingers, they wanted to use this story to kind of beat up on, what they call the deep state, and help Trump do that. And the liberal media is kind of like, we hope that there's nothing in there that supports conspiracy theorists because they're, so irrational and stuff like that. We got to get past that,
I agree with you.
And with getting this record, and kudos to Trump, right? I don't agree with him on practically anything, but he definitely did the right thing on this, and you see it. We see it now, and we're going to get the benefits of it. Once people are a little patient, stop looking for the smoking gun and start looking for the fact pattern.
Jeff, while I have you, let's talk about Jack Ruby. That's where it all falls apart for me. Where it's just not falls apart per se, but that's where the ultra conspiracy starts to kick in.
You're not even trying.
Yeah, it's like, what are we doing here? He shoots this guy on live television. He says he's a patsy. Jolly West is involved. After reading the Chaos book, I'm like, oh, they literally mind control is real. I'm like, this is a CIA operation. Actually, there's a new Chaos documentary out now.
So about Jack Ruby, you go read the Warren Commission. They tried really, really hard, and they were successful in avoiding the fact that Jack Ruby was an organized crime figure. Yeah.
Right.
And they bought this ridiculous story that he killed him because he's angry.
Well, he's a super patriot. What?
Yeah. I talked to one of the women who worked for Jack Ruby in the club, and I asked her. Yeah. She was close to Ruby, and I said, why did he kill Oswald? And she said, I don't know, but she said Jack worked for people, and I don't think he had a choice.
Yeah.
I thought that was very interesting. And I said, did he ever say anything good or bad about President Kennedy? She said, I never heard anything, but he hated Bobby Kennedy with a purple passion. Something the Warren Commission also totally omitted.
Because he was trying to go after all the...
all the organized
He did the
guys.
test, he brought them, exactly.
Yeah. So, people say, was there an organized crime plot? We know the organized crime role in what happened, and that was to eliminate the most important witness, Oswald. I was on Piers Morgan, and Michael Franzine, who was kind of a made guy in the mafia.
I know he is, he's a big YouTuber. Right?
Yeah, he's a talking head now about that. And he said, when I was in the mob and we talked to these guys, it was common knowledge, totally accepted. We were asked to get rid of Oswald, and we did it. That was our part. Right. And they were very matter of fact about it. And I thought, this guy knows, he was in that world. So that's the organized crime part of it. Jack Ruby is the organized crime component of what happened. We can talk about what really happened that day, but clearly Oswald was not supposed to be captured alive.
Yes.
And when Oswald was captured alive, those people in the CIA who'd been watching him for 4 years, they had a big problem because Oswald was not unaware that, he had friends, he had people who assisted him. And he was he's a smart guy, enterprising guy. So he took advantage of those contacts that he had. But that's the story that's coming out, is Angleton's role around Oswald, the surveillance of Oswald, and what was really going on there. My friends in the mainstream media said they were just incompetent, When top CIA officials lie in a homicide investigation, I can't take that as evidence of incompetence. To me, that looks more like complicity. Yes. That's where we're at now.
Okay. Yeah. All right, man. I always love talking to you, Jeff. Plug, what else you got to plug?
So if you want to follow me, JFK Facts on Substack, jfkfacts.substack.com. And more to come.
All right, excellent. We'll have a link down in the description. Everybody go watch his testimony, too, April 1st.